to Like Maria. We're back again today talking about Keats. Now, Maria's already done some videos about particular poems, but today she's going to tell us a little bit about who Keats was. We're just starting off studying Keats. We don't know much about him. What should we know to begin with? Why should we be interested in Keats?
Well, one of the reasons that we should be so interested in him is that he died very young. He was born in 1795. By 1821, the very beginning of that year, he's dead. But despite that, he was hugely prolific, and he really changed the sort of scene of English poetry forever. He was one of the Romantic poets, and Byron, Coleridge, Wordsworth, and so on were all involved in this kind of creativity at the beginning of the 19th century. But Keats really stands out because, firstly, he died so young, but he was so prolific. And also, he was a bit of an outsider. I mean, certainly some of the other poets looked down upon him. His nickname was the Cockney Poet. He felt as an outsider. He hadn't been educated at university, which was very unusual in those days for someone aspiring to be a poet. He worked as a sort of apothecary and a surgeon at times. He had no money, so he really, struggled in the world. And despite all these trials and tribulations, or perhaps someone might say because of them, he became a poet so in touch with emotional experience and the very sort of nitty-gritty raw experience of living and indeed suffering. And he wrote the most beautiful reflections on pain and pleasure, and how the two interplay with each other. And really, to read Keats is to indulge and reflect on your own state of mind and really feel his feelings.
Gosh, you've really sold it to me already. I'm hooked. So where should I go? What are some of the greatest works that I should be reading?
Well, one of the ways in that I find most useful is to read his poetry alongside his letters. So this is one of the great things with Keats. He sees something, he'll see a field, he'll be by the sea, he'll see famously a Grecian urn or a nightingale, and he will run off and write a poem about it. He's so enthused by a visual stimulus or an idea, and he'll go off and run away and literally scribble out the poem. And so I think it's really useful to read chronologically through Keats. So starting off with some of his very early sonnets, so something like On the Sea or To Sleep, really good places to start. Also, really famous sonnet, When I Have Fears That I May Cease to Be. And that really gives you a flavour of Keats's concerns about his own life, and really it's about contemplating death. And some of those early accessible sonnets then perhaps move on to something a bit longer, like the Eve of St. Agnes, or one of his famous ones, Isabella, which is about a grieving woman who has been thwarted out of love by her two evil brothers, which is a real sort of romp through of emotions. And for the more serious sort of classicists out there, and perhaps something like Hyperion, which is his attempt at an epic. So that really requires a little bit more study. So it depends on what takes your fancy, really. Obviously, we've got the odes as well. Towards the end of his career, his more mature, considered writing, and that is really he's at the top of his game when he writes those.
Could you tell us a little bit more about those odes, Maria?
Okay, so he sort of cuts his teeth, Keats, on what you might term some sort of kind of apprenticeship in poetry. And he did write and imitate quite a lot of the great poets. So we know that he wrote in Miltonic style. He really admired Spenser. And he actually emulated some of Shakespeare's literary work in some of his sonnets. So he dabbled and really sort of trained himself and cut his teeth on those early pieces of work. But then in 1819, after a really difficult winter, after his brother had sadly died very young, Keats suddenly kind of grasped the nettle and stepped out into the world and introduced the world to the romantic ode form, which he had created. And you can really see him moving from the sonnets and actually flourishing and being really at the top of the game in these odes, these longer poems which are more sustained. You may well have heard of Ode to a Nightingale, Ode on a Grecian Urn, Ode to Psyche. So there are really 5 key odes, and then that were written in the spring in 1819. And you can see his creativity and his joy here. And he talks about the difficulties of creating poetry. He ponders the big questions about what art is and what art does for us. He talks about beauty and the pursuit of beauty and the pursuit of truth and what this is in the world. And of course, at this time, he is bereaved and concerned about, in fact, his own health as well. So much of his writing at this time is focused on the passing of time and human mortality. We finish up in the autumn of that year, 1819, with his famous poem To Autumn, which isn't titled as an ode, but in form it is very similar to the other great odes. So these are the poems that we're really referring to when we talk about Keats's great odes.
Thank you. You mentioned that he was bereaved. You mentioned that he dies very young. It sounds like he had a pretty tragic life. Please tell me that there were some moments of happiness in there.
Well, actually, yes, he was a very tragic figure in many ways. And his life was indeed packed with misery, and this is something that he reflected on in his poetry. And indeed, some people find it quite difficult to read Keats because he just literally does wallow in a lot of misery sometimes. It starts off when he's quite young. His father died in an accident. He fell off a horse. And then his mother died of TB when he was relatively young as well. This horrible disease that did away with a lot of talent in the 19th century. And then, as I've mentioned, his brother Tom died in his sort of youth as well, really. So it was a terrible time, and Keats himself, he sat by his mother and he sat by his brother when they were dying and ministered to them and looked after them. So he really had lived experience of quite a horrendous time. Combined with this, when Tom was diagnosed with TB, Keats came to the realization that he was actually quite unwell also, and the final years of his life, certainly the final 6 months, were quite horrific. He was sent to Rome by doctors, and essentially he just went downhill from there. So really tragic life. Also, he was miserable in love. He fell in love with a lady, Fanny Brawne, whose mother didn't think that Keats was good enough. And he really wasn't able to fulfill that relationship. There are many letters that exchanged between the pair of them, but that never really came to anything. There is talk of a secret engagement, and that may well have been the case. But in terms of ever having any prospects of happiness and living together, that was really not ever going to be possible. So Keats dwelt on that a lot. The other thing which kind of perturbed him, and this is really the fault of the time and the fault of his romantic poet buddies, is that Keats had a great sensitivity. And sometimes he was kind of accused of being rather effeminate in this way. And it wasn't cool, it wasn't macho. to be lovesick and to have fallen for a woman and to appreciate the female kind of in your life. And so he was kind of torn between this kind of romantic poet figure that he was supposed to be, and he wanted to fit in with the others in some ways, and this kind of sensitivity and connection with his feminine side, I suppose we would call it these days. And he wasn't, although when he was young he did get into plenty of scraps and fights, etc., apparently. But he wasn't a large man. He was only 5'2". And if you look at some of the paintings, etc., he has a quite gentle nature about him. And this was sometimes problematic for himself, and certainly something that the other poets kind of looked down upon somewhat.
It sounds like he had a pretty tough time. And just to finish off, would you say it's useful for us to know a bit about that context when we read his work?
Absolutely. As I've said, if you read the letters, you get a good clue about his life. I think it's really important, particularly, to know where he was living, because he often looks out the window or goes for a walk. He was a great walker, partly because he was financially, he wasn't on the breadline, but he wasn't Lord Byron. So he used to walk around London. When he lived in Winchester, he walked around. He would go walking in the north of England, etc. And he often writes about something he's seen. Certainly when he's by the sea, that makes him write a poem about the sea. He visited the British Museum, and he wrote about the Grecian urn. It wasn't a particular urn that he saw, but he had this idea. So it really is important to make a connection to the place that he's inhabiting. Also very important, I think, is he trained as an apothecary and eventually became a surgeon. He passed the exams to his own and many other people's amazement, really. So he has got this kind of knowledge of science, such as it was in the 19th century, but also a knowledge of, I know it sounds rather grim, but the inside of people's bodies and organs. And I think that sometimes comes through, particularly when he's talking about the brain. He will have witnessed post-mortem examinations, and he was, practical in many ways. He knew about death and suffering and disease in a very visceral, physical way. And that certainly comes through in some moments in his poetry.
Okay, thank you so much. You've given us so much information about Keats and made me think about him in a different way. There's a lot more to him than just his famous poetry. So thank you very much, and thank you to everyone at home for watching, and please do subscribe if you like our content.